Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. I am Jozefien de Leersnyder.
And I'm Michael Boiger. And we have been collaborators since the very beginning of our PhDs, working with Batja Mesquida in Leuven. And we're also both connected with the Cultural Psychology Masters at the University of Amsterdam.
Yes, and in our past lab meetings, on daily commutes to work, or also at conferences, Michael and I, we have been talking about what culture and emotions really are and how they might interconnect so many times that you could say that we came over the years to a shared perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And we're very happy that we have this opportunity today to share with you this shared perspective during our joint keynote.
Let's get started. If we talk about our shared perspective, we really talk about the cultural and relational dynamics of emotion, something we study both in terms of cultural variation and intercultural context. Remember the last time you experienced an emotion. Could have been this morning when you noticed you ran out of coffee and couldn't start the day with your favorite brew. Or around lunchtime when you wanted to take your bike to meet a friend for lunch but noticed your bike was removed, probably by the building caretaker. Or just now when you discovered the presence of some colleagues from abroad at this online keynote event. When you think about these episodes, you probably realize that your emotions make you aware of things that matter to you, that your morning coffee stands for precious me time and pleasure, that your friend and keeping promises to be on time is important to you because you see it as a sign of care and respect, and that familiar faces of international colleagues remind you that you belong to the IACCP community. In addition, your emotions might have helped you to show the way on how to navigate these daily situations. Your morning grumpiness may have urged you to get dressed quickly and get a coffee at the stall down the street. And your anger towards the building caretaker may actually have prepared you to run to the metro and still be on time to meet your friend. And your feeling of belonging to the ICCP community may be accompanied by head nods, smiles, waves, and perhaps even quick text via the chat. So instead of being random or irrational forces, day-to-day emotions may help people to deal with the things they care for by focusing their attention and proposing heuristics for solution. Emotions thus help us navigate the social environments. To make this more concrete, let's take a look at the situation of the bike removal. Although it looks quite straightforward and you can immediately imagine how you would feel, people could actually experience quite different types of emotion upon this very same situation. And when we say emotion, we mean the amalgam of different emotion components, such as their appraisal or evaluation of the situation, their action tendencies, subjective experience, and their emotional behavior. So concretely for this situation, you could appraise it from autonomy concerns, seeing the situation as unfair and seeing the caretaker as rude and ridiculously obsessed with rules. In that case, you might want him to give a piece of your mind, and you would label your subjective experience as a combination of anger and contempt. On your face, we would then perhaps find a frown and a dimple. However, you could also appraise the situation from relatedness concerns, acknowledging you should have known better when parking your bike irregularly and feeling the need to apologize for that. When asked, you would then probably label your subjective experience as shame, and your face, well, we might not see that as it might be turned down. Thus, the same situation can be associated with very different types of emotion that reflect the stance you take in your relationship as you are evaluating the event, and your intention to act in a certain way from a certain position in that relationship with a specific relational goal in mind. We could just say that emotions are relationship acts. Yet as our examples showed, we could act with quite different relationship goals and concerns in mind, which leads us to expect that the salience of different types of relationship goals and concerns might be associated with different types of emotion. First evidence for this idea comes from cross-cultural studies in the early 2000s, which showed that people not only classify their emotions along a positive-negative axis, but also along autonomy-promoting versus relatedness-promoting axis. Within this two-dimensional space, pride is a positive autonomy-promoting emotion as it signals one's autonomy and success, whereas closeness is obviously a positive relatedness-promoting emotion. Perhaps a bit counterintuitive, because anger is always embedded in a relationship, these studies showed that anger was considered as an autonomy-promoting emotion, as it signals that the other has violated your own wishes and has crossed your boundaries. And it helps you to protect your individual rights because you really ask the other person to accommodate to what you want. In contrast, shame is considered a relatedness-promoting emotion, as it signals that you care for the other and engage in self-reflection to protect and improve your relationship. More recent research from our lab furthermore established a direct link between the emotions that people experience and the concerns that are salient in a situation. Specifically, 3 studies, of which one cross-cultural and one using momentary reports of emotional episodes instead of retrospective self-reports, all showed that when autonomy concerns, such as success and ambition, were most relevant to a situation, people were also most likely to experience autonomy-promoting emotions, such as pride and anger. In contrast, when relatedness concerns, such as loyalty and helping others, were deemed most relevant to a situation, people were more likely to experience relatedness-promoting emotions, such as closeness and shame. Therefore, we could think of emotions not only as relationship acts, but as specific acts that reflect specific relationship concerns. Yet, as we all know as cultural psychologists, concerns, goals, or values tend to differ systematically across different cultural contexts. One way in which we know that these concerns, values, and relationship ideals differ is along the lines of independence and interdependence. Americans and Western Europeans achieve interdependence in their relationships by focusing on themselves rather than on others, and by doing things that make them feel good about themselves. Self-help books teach people to handle social relationships much like oxygen masks on airplane. If you make sure that your needs are met first, you will be better in meeting the needs of others. In comparison, in Japanese and other East Asian contexts, and although not exactly in the same way, also Turkish contexts, these emphasize a more interdependent approach. People protect relatedness with other people by focusing on the perspective of the others rather than on their own. This also comes with being more self-critical and with adjusting oneself to others. In short, you could say that as long as everybody takes care of everybody else, everybody's needs are met. In sum, we could say that emotions are relationship acts that reflect particular concerns, which tend to differ across different cultural contexts.
Thank you, Jozi, for setting up this theoretical framework about emotion, which is really at the core of both of our research programs. And it's from this framework that we have derived and over the years tested 3 overarching predictions. We reasoned that if emotions are relationship acts that reflect specific concerns, which tend to differ across cultures, then emotions should differ systematically across cultures because as the dominant concerns differ, so do the common emotional experiences. We also reasoned that variation in emotions should emerge from social relationships because this is where concerns are actively negotiated. And finally, we reasoned that engaging in different or new social contexts should change emotional experience because as people start interacting with people from their new environment, different and new emotions may become helpful for these kinds of interactions. In the remainder of this talk, we will provide empirical evidence from our labs on these 3 predictions, showing that there is a cultural logic to emotional experience, that differences in emotions emerge during social interactions, and that emotions change when people from different cultures meet. Let's start by looking at the first prediction, that there's a cultural logic to emotion. When Jozi talked of autonomy and relatedness promoting emotions, you may have already observed an overlap with the different concerns of independence and interdependence. And it's this overlap that leads to what we call a cultural logic to emotion. When we look at the different cultural relationship ideals of independence and interdependence, we can expect that different kinds of emotions are more or less helpful in achieving them. Autonomy promoting emotions help people take a first-person perspective. Anger, for example, helps people knowing what they want and make sure that their needs are met. Something that is quite useful from the perspective of a person who values independence. However, autonomy promoting emotions are less useful for putting other people's needs first. Relatedness promoting emotions, in contrast, help to take a third-person perspective. Shame, for example, makes people aware of their shortcomings in the eyes of others, which isn't something that is desirable from the perspective of an independent self. On the other hand, in interdependent contexts, shame helps people know when something went wrong and quickly fix things to keep relationships smooth. To test this idea, we started at the top of our model by first asking if there's a cultural logic to the kinds of situations that people experience frequently. And we expected that people's environment should be structured in a way so that they have a lot of opportunities to experience these thumbs up or culturally condoned emotions, and not so many to experience the thumbs down or culturally less valued emotions. To test these predictions, we focused on two emotions, anger and shame, and we started by looking at the cultural context of the United States and Japan. We first sampled anger and shame situations from interviews and experience sampling with American and Japanese participants, and from this large pool of situations, we selected 20 anger and 20 shame situations, and then we asked a new group of participants to tell us for each of these situations, how frequently does this kind of situation happen in your culture, and how angry or ashamed would you be if this happened? To give you an example, this is an anger situation from the United States where Ryan went to college away from home. He came home to see his family over the holidays, and whenever he talked about something of which he felt proud, his father changed the topic to his younger brother's football career. You can see how that may be upsetting to some people. Let's look at what we found first for anger. Remember that we expected the angering situations to happen frequently in the United States and rarely in Japan. That's exactly what we found. While the Americans said that the more angering a situation is, the more frequently it happens, the Japanese participants told us that the more angering it is, the less frequently it happens. And the things that happen commonly thus are the things that aren't very upsetting. For shame, we expected the opposite picture. And in line with what we expected, Americans thought that shameful situations were rare in their culture, while Japanese thought that situations in which people feel a lot of shame happen quite often in Japan. However, Japan isn't the only cultural context in which interdependence matters, and we thought it was interesting to zoom in on that concern of interdependence and see if we can make predictions about different kinds of interdependent concerns. We found that in both Turkey and Japan, people value their social image, but they deal with it in different ways. In Japan, people deal with their social image in terms of keeping face, while in Turkey, people are primarily concerned with defending their honor. What honor and face have in common is that both concerns highlight the way that other people see you. So people are very aware of an outside perspective, and we would consequently expect that shame is valued and frequently encountered in both of these contexts. What sets honor and face apart is that face is really something you have or don't have, and you cannot do so much to actively increase it. In fact, getting angry when you want more face doesn't really work. It's quite the opposite. It would make you lose face faster. Honor, in contrast, is something you have to actively defend so others don't take it away from you. So you can see how anger may be helpful in making sure that your honor is being defended. Starting from these concerns, my collaborators and I collected new situations. We created a new questionnaire and gave that questionnaire to another group of Japanese and Turkish participants. When we look at the results for anger, we found what we expected. The Turkish students think that the more angering a situation is, the more frequently it happens, presumably helping them defend their honor concerns, while the Japanese students, as before, thought that the more angering, the less frequent. And for shame, we also found what we expected. In line with honor and face concerns, the more shameful situations were, the more frequent people thought they would be in their culture. So this cultural logic worked in 3 cultures, the US, Japan, and Turkey. And I can tell you that when we repeated the research in Belgium, we found that it worked there too. And at this point, we wondered if this cultural logic extends to other elements of people's environments. Because people don't only interact with other people, but they also interact with the cultural products around them. And one particularly interesting cultural product is children's books, because presumably parents pick the kinds of books to read to their children that they think are helpful in socializing them. To have our predictions about the concerns that matter to Belgians and US Americans, we again zoomed in on the concern of independence. And we found that while Americans think that being independent means being successful in competing against others, Belgians tend to believe that everybody has the same equal rights and that these rights need to be respected and protected, taking a more egalitarian perspective. And consequently, anger and shame may play a somewhat different role in Belgium compared to the US. In the US, as before, we would expect the same pattern. Anger is common, while shame is avoided and rare. In Belgium, on the other hand, anger should play a more ambivalent role. It may still be common, but because anger may trespass on the rights of others, this deserves attention and possibly needs to be fixed. And shame may actually be somewhat helpful in doing exactly that, fixing relationships that have gone wrong. So we would expect shame to be fairly common. We collected the best-selling children's books in each country and coded for anger and shame episodes. And when we looked at what emotions were frequent in the children's books, we found again the pattern that was in line with the kinds of concerns people have. While we found that about 1/3 of the children's books in the US contained anger episodes, we also found that a comparable number of Belgian children's books portrayed anger. However, when the characters got angry in Belgians' children's books, they would later regret their feelings and feel shame, a pattern that we didn't find in the United States. In fact, none of the US books made any reference to shame, while about 1/4 of the Belgian ones did. So when we take these findings together, it becomes quite clear that emotions systematically fit the logic of the cultural context, be it in terms of the situations that people encounter or the kinds of stories they like to read to their children. In both cases, people's environments afford situations that elicit or portray emotions that are consistent with cultural concerns. However, something that also became clear is that in all of the cultures we studied, all of these situations happen at least sometimes. Even though it's not very desirable for Japanese, they do encounter anger situations. And the same is true for Americans in shame situations. And the second question then is, how do people respond to these situations? is there also a cultural logic in how they interpret situations and what they feel like doing about them? To come back to our emotion model, this means that we were interested in the appraisals and action tendencies people feel in response to situations. We predicted that there are different kinds of responses, like in our example, and that the most common kinds differ across cultures. And of course, like before, we predicted that the common kinds of responses should reflect cultural concerns in line with there being a cultural logic. In the example, you could think that the responses on the left that come with more other blame and aggression are more fitting with independent concerns because they highlight a first-person perspective and they also make sure that you get what you want. To test this, we created a questionnaire in which people read situations and were asked to tell us how they would respond. We gave this questionnaire to almost 1,000 participants from the United States, Belgium, and Japan, and asked them to tell us about their responses in terms of 8 appraisals and 9 action tendencies. And we didn't only do this for one situation, but for 15 situations. And we made sure that these situations and appraisals and action tendencies were relevant for participants from all cultures in preparatory research. Now, as you can see, and I'm showing this in this data cube, this created a fairly complex data set with 3 ways, but it was important to us to not simply average responses across situations. If you think back to our framework of emotions as relational acts, then different specific concerns of the whole set of concerns within a culture may be active in each situation, and averaging would mask this. Now, to model this situational variation, we used an algorithm that identified types of people who responded to situations in similar ways. So rather than assuming that there is such a thing as a typical Belgian or Japanese response type, we checked what types we found in the data. And you can think of this as an extremely skilled research assistant who looks at the entire questionnaire, puts it in a pile, looks at the next questionnaire, and decides if the response is sufficiently similar to be put in the same pile or if a new pile needs to be created. For anger, the algorithm told us that there were 2 types of responses across situations in our data. When we looked at how these response types were distributed across cultures, we found that there was a dominant Japanese type and a type that was common in the United States and in Belgium. For shame, the algorithm told us that there were 3 types. Now, we were hopeful. We had 3 cultural groups, and when we checked, our hopes were justified. There was a dominant American, US American type, a dominant Japanese type, and a dominant Belgian type. And we also checked if these types differed by other variables such as gender or socioeconomic status, different personality measures, and we found that cultural group was by far the best predictor. But what about the cultural logic to these types? As you can imagine, it's pretty difficult to show you the entire pattern for all appraisals, action tendencies across all the situations. So I selected one appraisal that explained the difference between the types well, and that was other blame. And I will also show you only a subset of the situations that differed among theoretically relevant dimensions of intentionality and closeness. And when we look at other blame across these situations, there are 2 situations that stand out. These were the situations in which these 2 types felt the most other blame. Type 1, who consisted primarily of Japanese participants, blamed distant others who were purposefully rude, for example, strangers who hollered at them on a narrow stairway. In contrast, type 2, the primarily Belgian and American type, primarily blamed close others who failed to meet relational norms, For example, a grandmother telling you that you're fat and you need to eat less. And this fits the cultural concerns in each culture. Japanese are primarily concerned with protecting their close relationships and thus refrain from other blame in these instances. In contrast, Americans and Western Europeans are more concerned with protecting their autonomy. And this plays a more central role in close relationships, where these relational norms ensure good treatment while allowing for autonomy. So the culturally most common types of anger and shame highlight emotional content that aligns with cultural concerns.
Yes, as Michael just showed, the kinds of emotions that are most helpful in achieving the cultural concerns are thus more prevalent than those that are not. This may lead us to expect that people in the same cultural context report similar patterns of subjective experience, and that doing so might be functional, such that experiencing culturally valued emotions is associated with well-being. To test these predictions in a stringent way, our lab has developed and used a cultural fit approach that moves beyond averages of individual emotions to look at correspondences between an individual's and the culture's patterns of emotion, that are the intensities with which people experience a whole set of emotions in a particular situation. Coming back to our example of the bike removal, we would thus not study cultural differences in mean levels of anger, but to what extent an individual's pattern of experience matches the cultural pattern in which anger is dominant and contempt is secondary, or the cultural pattern in which shame is the dominant emotion and anger is secondary. To capture these emotional patterns, we make use of a questionnaire that asks people to describe a situation from their own daily life that matches 1 out of 8 different types of prompts. And then we ask them to report how they felt in that situation by rating their experience on a set of 15 to 20 emotions. To then calculate people's emotional fit with culture, we first calculate average patterns of emotion for each type of situation across all participants who belong to the same sociocultural group. Let's say all participants from a Belgian sample and all participants from a Turkish sample. Subsequently, we then calculate the profile correlation between each individual's pattern of emotion for a given culture and the corresponding average pattern of either one's own cultural group or another cultural group. So we could have an index of people's fit with their own culture and an index of the fit with another culture. Supporting the idea that people in the same cultural context report similar patterns of subjective experience, our studies find that people indeed fit the typical patterns of their own culture much better than those of another cultural group. Specifically, and comparing Belgians and Turks, we found that Belgians fitted better with the Belgian than with the Turkish patterns, whereas Turks fitted better with the Turkish than with the Belgian patterns of emotion. And likewise, our study comparing Koreans and European Americans yielded that Koreans fitted better with the Korean than the European American patterns, while the opposite was true for European Americans. Furthermore, when we linked people's emotional fit with their own culture to indices of well-being, we also found support for the idea that emotional fit is rewarding. Specifically, in both the US, Korea, and Belgium, we found that higher relational well-being was predicted by people's higher emotional fit with one's own culture in relatedness promoting situations. Moreover, we found that higher psychological well-being was associated with higher emotional fit in those specific situations that were most central or most helpful to achieving one's cultural concerns. So, for instance, relatedness promoting situations in family context in Korea and autonomy promoting situations at work in the US, fitting into those situations was most strongly associated with psychological health and well-being in these specific contexts. So in sum, we could say that people's patterns of emotional experience just tend to be in line with those of others in their cultural context, and that people benefit from emotional fit with their culture, suggesting that adhering to the cultural logic of emotions is thus rewarding. But how does this cultural logic and its benefits unfold and come about in real-life interactions with others?
Now, this brings us to our next prediction, namely that differences in emotions emerge during social interactions. To explore this, we will first focus on interactions between romantic partners. Now, couples are a great way to study emotional emergence. If you've been in a relationship for some time, you will probably have experienced that your concerns or what you care most about in life becomes quite tangible. And during disagreements, these concerns are often at stake. Now, I don't have to explain to you that when concerns are at stake, people tend to get emotional. And to study this, we asked couples to tell us about their areas of disagreement and also to tell us how they were doing as a couple and what concerns they cared about. We then invited them to the lab where they engaged in a series of interactions. We were primarily interested in the disagreement interaction where they discussed one of these areas of disagreements. And we told them to do this like at home and to discuss it for 10 minutes. And to get to people's emotional experience, we had them rewatch the videos right after the interaction. And those videos would stop every 30 seconds. And then participants were asked to tell us to what extent they felt each of 12 emotions during the last 30 seconds when the interaction actually happened. We also asked them to do this for positive and negative affect and to give us a continuous rating. I won't talk about these data, but if you're interested, please go check out the Triandus Award lecture of the second author on the study, Alexander Kirchner-Häusler. In our study, we had 116 Belgian and 160 Japanese participants who came from 58 and 80 couples respectively. These were heterosexual couples who had been together for about 15 years. We matched the relationship duration in both samples. And as you can see, these were community samples. So people in their mid-40s on average who'd been together for quite some time. To identify which emotions have been particularly relevant for each couple's interaction and thus probably reflect people's concerns, we looked for emotional states to which the couples gravitate, or in other words, their emotional attractors. To show you an example, this is the interaction of a Japanese couple. And for each segment, we identified the primary emotion of each partner and then plotted these on the x-axis for male partners and on the y-axis for female partners. And you can see here the couple moves through different emotional states, but they repeatedly return to an emotional state of mutual empathy. And when we run the attractor analysis, this state comes out as the attractor state for the couple. So we can assume that this is something that mattered for the interaction and presumably for the couple. We then did this, of course, for all the couples, and we plotted the attractors that we found for each of the cultural groups. And what these graphs show you is how many of the couples in each culture experienced each emotional state as an attractor state. So for example, here in Belgium, we found that 9% of the Belgian couples experienced an attractor state where both partners were annoyed. Very much in line with what we would have expected. We identified a range of other attractor states that had to do with being strong or resigning, presumably either the interaction going according to what you want or not going according to what you want. In Japan, in contrast, the most common attractor state was mutual empathy. And that clearly underlines the perspective taking that we thought was so important for interdependent relationships. In the next step, we then looked at what are the consequences of having these attractors. So we compared the couples who had at least one of these central or common cultural attractor states against the ones who didn't. And when we did this, we found that in Belgium, these couples reported more relationship satisfaction, and they also reported valuing autonomy more. So we have some indication that having these culturally typical attractors is beneficial. Unfortunately, in Japan, we didn't find any differences. So to sum up, we found that during ongoing disagreements, couples gravitate towards emotional states that, as we expected, reflect culturally valued relationship ideals.
Yes, this whole story Michael just told you triggers the question of what the active ingredients might be that make people experience and express culturally valued emotions in social interactions. A common explanation is that cultural display rules would dictate which emotions are allowed and which are not. Yet another explanation that follows from both our theoretical framework and the study Michael just presented is that this variation in emotion can be linked to the differential salience of specific cultural concerns, as different concerns might be highlighted in different cultural contexts, and different concerns might be associated with different emotions. For instance, literature has shown that when autonomy concerns are violated, the most prevalent emotion is anger, while when community concerns are violated, the most prevalent emotion seems to be contempt. As we then know that the concerns for autonomy are at the foreground of the meaning-making system that is most prevalent in the Belgian cultural context, while those of community concerns are at the foreground in the Turkish cultural context, we decided to conduct an experimental study with Turkish Belgian biculturals in which we would try to prime the salient of these cultural concerns. Specifically, we manipulated the most salient concerns by randomly assigning these Turkish Belgian participants to interact with a stranger in either a Belgian autonomy promoting context or a Turkish relatedness promoting context. In the Belgian context, which we created in a neighborhood center of that particular neighborhood, participants interacted in Dutch with a Belgian other neighbor and a Belgian experimenter. In the Turkish setting, which we created 200 meters down the same street in the social room attached to the mosque of that neighborhood, participants interacted with a Turkish neighbor in the Turkish language and under supervision of a Turkish experimenter. In both settings, participants collaborated with that neighbor on a plan on how to improve their neighborhood, a task that allowed them to both care for autonomy, as they had to be creative and come up with new ideas, and allowed them to care for community concerns, as they had to collaborate with that neighbor. Now, as you might guess by now, that neighbor was not actually a neighbor, but it was a confederate of our research. And these confederates were always matched to the gender of our participants and followed a 25 minutes script, which we had extensively pre-tested, but a script to violate specific types of concerns. There were 5 concern violations in total. One was a clear-cut autonomy violation, another was a clear-cut community violation, and 3 times the Confederates enacted ambiguous violations that could be interpreted either as a violation of autonomy or a violation of community. All these interactions, they were videotaped, and a multicultural team of coders coded the videos for behaviors of anger and contempt. What we expected is that when the situations were ambiguous, biculturals would rely on the cultural context's most salient concerns to make sense of what was going on. And thus, we expected that we would observe different patterns of emotion depending on whether these ambiguous situations occurred in either Belgian or the Turkish context. And this is exactly what we found. When these ambiguous situations occurred in the Belgian context, biculturals showed much more anger cues than contempt cues. But when these same situations occurred in the Turkish context, they were met with equal anger and contempt cues. Now, showing the power of salient cultural concerns in shaping these patterns, we found that this pattern in the Belgian context with more anger than contempt mirrored the one we had found for the clear-cut autonomy violations in both the Belgian and the Turkish contexts. Yet, the pattern of emotions in ambiguous situations in the Turkish context, so with equal contempt and anger, resembled, although not 100%, but closely, the one that's characteristic for clear-cut community concerns. And what's more, and I won't show it here, but trust me, these different patterns of emotion, they could not be explained away by displayables, as the Turkish-Belgian behavioral attempts to suppress their emotions did not differ across these clear-cut versus ambiguous situations. What this experiment shows is that emotions might emerge in social interactions from the cultural concerns that are most salient. This insight brings us to our last chapter in this keynote, namely the one in which we investigate what happens to people's emotional life when they start engaging in a cultural context that is characterized by the differential salience of concerns, by different salient concerns, and also by different ways in which social interactions unfold. The question here is, would people's emotions acculturate? And as we will show, the answer seems to be yes. Emotions change when people from different cultures meet. To investigate the question of emotional acculturation, we have conducted 3 studies: a small-scale study on Korean Americans, a larger-scale study on Turkish Belgians, and recently a representative and longitudinal study including social networks on minority youth in Belgium. In all studies, we employed the cultural fit approach that I explained before. Yet now we calculated people's emotional fit with their respective majority culture. When doing so for majority members themselves, we always made sure to delete their own patterns from the average pattern before calculating their fit, as we wanted to avoid an artificial inflation of the fit scores. Analyzing our data at a group level yielded first evidence for emotional acculturation. Majority members had significantly higher emotional fit than first-generation immigrant minorities. Yet, with each increasing generation, minorities' fit scores seemed to go up, such that the fit scores of the third-generation youth were at about the same height as those of majority youth themselves. At the individual level, we looked at the associations between emotional fit with the majority culture and immigrant minorities' ratings on classic acculturation questions, such as, to what extent do you want to adopt the attitudes and traditions of the new majority culture? What we found was that people's answers to this question were not associated with their emotional fit with culture. And when we looked at people's attitudes towards having contact with majority members, we found positive association between this and their emotional fit for both the Koreans in the US and the minority youth, but not for the Turks in Belgium. This hints at the idea that having social contact might be associated with emotional fit, but this is still at the attitude level. When scrutinizing the variables of actual cultural exposure and engagement, we indeed did found that immigrant minorities' emotional fit was positively associated with them. Specifically, people's proportion of life they had spent in a new culture was positively associated with a fit, and the age at which they had immigrated to the new culture was negatively associated with the fit. Also, immigrant minorities' fit with the majority culture was positively associated with their amount of social contact with majority members. However, in our large-scale study with minority youth, we found that this association between social contact and fit did not hold true for our direct measure of social contact, namely, how many majority friends do you have, but only for our indirect measure, namely, how often do you speak your heritage cultural language at school, which indicates how much time our minority participants are spending with other minority youth who speak the same language instead of with majority peers. When controlling for these actual levels of social contact, the previously shown effects of attitudes towards majority social contact completely disappeared. This suggests that minorities' emotional fit with culture is not a function of their explicit cultural affiliations as captured by attitude measures, but a function of their actual social engagements in the majority culture. Further supporting the idea that social contact is driving emotional changes, our former student and now postdoc Alba Yassini, who is the laureate of this year's IACCP Dissertation Prize, conducted 2 follow-up studies. The first one is a social network study, in which we try to predict minority youths' emotional fit with the typical patterns of their majority peers from their friendship networks. And I won't go into detail here, as I would like to invite you to massively attend Alba's symposium, but I'll give you just a teaser. The more incoming ties a minority student had, and thus the more he or she was nominated by Belgians as a friend, the higher was his or her emotional fit with the majority culture. The second study is a longitudinal one, for which we organized the second wave of data collection on the representative sample of minority youth in Belgium. So both in year 1 and in year 2, we have data on minority youth's emotional fit with the typical Belgian patterns and of their social contact with majority peers, both in the direct way, asking how many friends do you have, and in the indirect way, asking how much they use their heritage language at school. What we found was, and let me first say, these are effects of cross-lagged analysis. So first we controlled for within time correlations and autoregressive paths. But what we found was that the more immigrant minorities spoke their heritage language at school in year 1, the lower was their emotional fit in year 2 as compared to other students who did not use their heritage language that much. So this suggests that not speaking your heritage language, but instead interacting with majority peers might increase your emotional fit the next year. In addition, we found that the higher was minority youth's fit in year 1, the more majority friends they reported to have the next year. As such, there seems to be a bidirectional link between social contact and emotional fit. So the more minorities engage in social contact with majority members, the higher their fit the next year. Yet upon having higher fit in year 1, the more friends they have and also the more contact they might have the next year. Taken together, there is this evidence that minorities may come to acquire the majority culture's emotional pattern. And this brings us to the question, what may happen to minorities' fit with their heritage cultural context? Our experiment on Turkish Belgian biculturals had suggested they might internalize both repertoires, as they can flexibly switch between them depending on which concerns are most salient. Yet, how do minorities maintain these heritage patterns? How do they do that? So to investigate this issue, we extended our studies with samples of Turkish and Korean majority members. For the sake of time, I won't talk about the findings of the Korean Americans here, as they are exactly the same as for Turkish Belgians. Based on these additional data, we calculated another index of emotional fit with culture, this time people's fit with immigrant minorities' heritage culture. Mirroring our previous results, we found that emotional fit with the typical Turkish patterns was highest for the Turks in Turkey, lowest for Belgian majority members, probably never visited Turkey, and that the fits of Turkish immigrant minorities fell in between. At the individual level, we found that the only significant predictor of emotional fit with the heritage culture was how much time minorities actually spent with heritage culture friends, again suggesting that emotional fit with a culture is a function of one's social relationships rather than of mere cultural exposure or one's acculturation attitudes. In sum, we could just say that our endeavors into emotional acculturation suggest that emotions do change due to intercultural contact and thus might acculturate. And in this process, it seems that social contact, but not attitudes, are key drivers of emotional maintenance or change. Emotion dynamics, this seems to be a function of our relationship engagements. Yet, there is much more work to do to fully map the cultural and relational dynamics of emotion. For instance, one of our next big questions, on which my PhD student Fatana Mirzada will present the first results at this conference, is this one. How do people internalize novel emotional patterns? Which microprocesses, such as mimicry or grounding, occur in intercultural interactions that can account for emotional changes? A second question, on which my PhD student Erdem Yilmaz will present, is whether we can extend this dynamic and relational approach that we now apply to emotions also to other domains in cultural psychology, such as self-construal and cognition.
Yes, and from the research that our lab has been doing, we really became interested in understanding better what happens in intercultural couples where people presumably have different emotional repertoires. And if you're interested in that, we have some first data that we're sharing in a symposium that is organized by Anna Schoute. Besides the repertoires, we're also now looking into the strategies that couples use. And one thing we're finding is that it doesn't matter so much if intercultural couples are having emotional differences or not, but it really matters how they deal with these differences. So to sum up, we've shared with you our research along these 3 chapters, these 3 predictions, and we want to give you 3 take-home messages that we think are important messages that have implications not only for studying emotions, but also for the real world. First, emotions, as we've now told you many, many times, reflect the cultural concerns that are salient during social interactions. In terms of research, this implies that we think it's important to know what the central concerns are in the context that you're studying your emotions in, and to also study emotions as much as possible in their natural habitat, which is social relationships and interactions. In terms of real-world applications, this may mean that, for example, when you're working therapeutically with clients from different cultural contexts, you want to explore the meanings associated with emotions that may easily translate from one language to another, but that come with very different connotations. Second, we have found again and again that having culturally fitting emotions is beneficial. For us, this has a really important implication for real-world settings. In societies where multiple cultural meaning systems coexist, it's important to create environments, for example, at school, that do not only cater to one way of feeling. You could think about school practices that highlight pride versus those that also help people feel empathy. Having environments where people from different backgrounds feel like they belong, but where they can also have high quality interactions may help them recalibrate and possibly extend their emotional patterns. And finally, people can have multiple emotional repertoires that they flexibly apply to different contexts. This means that it's important to take into account that fitting in or belonging to a culture may not always be visible from the outside, from the clothes people wear or from the explicit statements that they make, but may really be about the emotions that they feel.
So, and on this note, we would like to thank everybody who collaborated with us on all the studies we just presented. And especially we would like to thank Batya Mesquita, who was the advisor of both Michael and my PhD, and so who encouraged the interdependence and the thinking between Michael and me on culture and emotions. She profoundly shaped this, as well as also encouraged us to go the extra mile and conduct these crazy high-risk experiments that we still conduct today in our respective labs. So thank you all for collaborating with us, and thank you for listening. See you at the conference.
Bye-bye.